Before the pyramids, before the empires, before even the first spoken word, there was silence. A world untouched by civilization, yet deep in the wild something was stirring. Spark fragile, but destined to shape the cosmos. This is not the history of kings and wars. This is the interior story of us, how a wandering species tamed fire, carved tools, and began the long, uncertain path to becoming human. Welcome to Still Rise, where history is told in whispers, not shouts, where empires rise in silence. We'll trace the interior evolution of humanity from the first breath under the stars to the digital pulse of our modern age. So breathe, sit back, let the centuries unfold. Part 1. Origins of humanity long before cities, before kings. Before time had numbers, there was just the earth, turning slowly under the stars. In the cradle of Africa, a warm, whispering plain under a sun that never slept, the story of humanity began. Not in thunder or triumph, but in quiet endurance. There were no names, no flags, no gods, only survival. A creature walked upright. 2 legs, curious hands, eyes that looked further than any animal had ever dared to look. They were not yet human. But something in them was different. They learned the rhythm of the stars. They learned to follow the herds, not just chase them. They didn't just react to the world. They remembered it. And memory was everything. Their hands became tools, sharp edges of stone, not just to kill, but to shape. The Stone Age wasn't savage, it was sacred. In every chipped rock, in every spark of fire struck from flint, they were writing their first sentence in a language the earth would understand. It wasn't power they sought, it was permanence, to last, to not be forgotten by the sky. They carved symbols in caves, animals, spirits, hunts, not for decoration, but for meaning. What is memory without symbols? What is life without story? And the greatest fire of all? Language. They began to speak at first, in grunts and gestures. But slowly, very slowly, they named the world tree, river, mother, moon. With every name, the world grew clearer. And with words came wonder, questions: why are we here? Where do we go when we die? Who made the stars? In their small camps under the African night, they looked up and began to dream. Migration followed. Not war, not conquest, just footsteps across continents into the unknown. They crossed deserts, mountains, frozen wastelands. To Australia, to Europe, to the Americas. They left no written record, but they left bones, fires, and echoes. We know them only by what they touched and what they became. Then came fire, not just warmth, not just safety, but community. Around the fire, they told stories. They passed wisdom. They remembered the dead. The fire was the first temple. In every gathering around it, the first civilization. They painted on cave walls with blood and ash, symbols not of war, but of awe. Herds of bison, hands pressed against stone, children dancing in shadow. These were not brutes, they were artists. The first humans were not defined by tools. They were defined by meaning, and so slowly humanity began to rise. But not in leaps, not in revolutions, in rhythms like the tide, like the moon. Just as the earth turns, they move toward something bigger. Farming was still far away. But the seeds of civilization were planted here, in curiosity, in silence. Looking up at the stars and whispering, there must be more. This is where it began. Not in a battle, not in a temple, but in silence. The story of civilization starts not with bricks, but with breath. And now we follow them into the age where humans no longer wandered but stayed. Part 2. The Stone Age to the Agricultural Revolution, before cities rose, before language was written down. Humanity survived not in stone temples or mighty cities, but in silence, in forests, on mountains, across rivers, with nothing but fire, stone, and instinct. This was the Stone Age, a time when every sunrise was uncertain and survival was never guaranteed. They were hunters-wanderers, mothers carrying children across icy plains, fathers tracking mammoth footsteps across miles of frozen earth. And yet, in this simplicity, human beings grew stronger, not in body, but in mind. They began to remember, to imagine, to draw symbols on the walls of caves, not just to mark a moment, but to transcend it. The cave paintings of Lascaux, the Venus figurines carved from bone, the flint tools shaped with careful precision, each a whisper from a mind awakening. But something was still missing. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans followed the rhythm of nature, seasons, herds, migration, until one day something shifted. They stopped chasing and started planting. The agricultural revolution, the most silent, powerful transformation in our species' history. They began to settle, to build homes from mud and straw, to raise goats, to tame grains like wheat and barley. In a place called the Fertile Crescent, life became stable. Children grew up in the same place, grandparents were remembered. Land became sacred. But with land came borders. With borders came ownership. And with ownership came conflict. It was here that humanity discovered something dangerous: power. The seeds we planted in the earth also planted the first roots of inequality. Where one had more, another had less. And yet, from this balance of creation and corruption, civilization would emerge. Not in glory, but in layers. Layer after layer, built upon dreams, fears, needs, and survival. And so, the hunter became the farmer, the wanderer became the settler, and the silent forests began to echo with human ambition. Part 3. Mesopotamia and early civilizations. In the beginning, there were only rivers, but beside those rivers something awakened, not loud, not sudden, like dawn creeping over the horizon. This was Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. And it became the cradle of something extraordinary: civilization. Here, people no longer just survived. They organized, they governed. They wrote their thoughts in clay, counted grain with symbols, built temples that reached toward stars they didn't yet understand, called their city Uruk. They built ziggurats, massive terraced temples of sun-dried brick, not just for worship but for power, because now power had changed form. No longer sat in muscles or tools, it lived in laws and priests, in stories etched into stone. And for the first time, humans began recording their voice, cuneiformed, the first writing system. Simple marks pressed into clay, but carrying the weight of debt, law, myth, and memory. The rise of structured society. Mesopotamia gave birth to the first kings. But kings did not rule alone. There were scribes who counted the harvest, priests who interpreted omens, laborers who shaped bricks from mud and sweat. This was not chaos, it was a machine. A social machine powered by belief, and belief was everything. They believed that storms came from gods, that floods were punishments, that rulers were chosen by the heavens. So they obeyed not just the king, but the very order of the universe. Law. The Code of Hammurabi from Babylon came. Hammurabi, a king who etched justice into stone. If a man puts out the eye of another, his eye shall be put out. Justice was no longer an idea. It was codified, recorded, carved. Every citizen knew their place and what would happen if they crossed the line. It was brutal, it was biased, but it was law. Beyond Mesopotamia, echoes of civilization. While Mesopotamia flourished, other voices rose quietly. In Sumer, the Epic of Gilgamesh whispered stories of mortality and gods. In Akkad, Sargon the Great created one of the first empires. In Assyria, militarism and cruelty reshaped warfare. Yet all shared one thing: the structure of belief. Whether it was in gods or kings, the future was no longer left to nature. It was written by men in stone and fire. The legacy of Mesopotamia. What Mesopotamia began never ended. Writing, law, cities, taxation, hierarchies, all of them echoes of this first experiment. A blueprint the rest of the world would copy, edit, and expand. But there was something else, something deeper. The belief that humans could shape the world around them, not just respond to it. That belief would birth empires. Part 4. Egypt, Indus Valley, and ancient China, ancient Egypt, land of eternity. They believed life continued after death. In a valley carved by the Nile, Egyptians built not just a civilization, but an eternal idea. Their entire existence was synchronized with the rhythms of a river. When it flooded, they rejoiced. When it dried, they feared. Pharaohs weren't just kings, they were gods on earth. Their word was law, their temples echoed divine purpose. and their tombs told the world they never intended to be forgotten. Pyramids didn't just rise with stone, they rose with meaning. A belief system wrapped in ritual, a bureaucracy that maintained order in the chaos of time. Hieroglyphs danced on tomb walls. Papyrus scrolls whispered of medicine, astronomy, and life. The ancient Egyptians didn't chase the future. They tried to outlast it, and in many ways they did. Indus Valley, the forgotten blueprint, while Egypt flourished. Farther east in today's Pakistan and northwest India, a different mystery bloomed. The cities of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa weren't ruled by pyramids or kings. They were ruled by planning, grid-like streets, underground drainage systems, wells in every house, public baths, granaries, citadels. No grand statues, no visible kings, no deciphered scripts, yet their silence is louder than empires. Who were these people? How did they build with such purpose, and then vanish with no clear reason? Is it climate, invasion, disease? They left no monuments. It's only balance, only order. And a question. Can a civilization be powerful without ever needing to show it? Ancient China, the mandate of heaven in the Yellow River Basin, something else stirred. The seeds of what would become one of the longest continuous civilizations in human history. China didn't just build walls and dynasties. It built a worldview. The Shang brought right and carved on oracle bones. The Zhou offered philosophy. Confucius spoke of ethics, Laozi of balance. Dynasties would rise with virtue and fall with corruption. And then came the mandate of heaven, a divine license to rule, given and taken away. This belief created cycles. It wasn't just political, it was spiritual. They believed a ruler's morality was tied to nature's behavior. Floods, droughts, famines, they weren't just natural events, they were warnings. Through silk, porcelain, and philosophy, China whispered to the future. Order is not found by conquering the world from the wisdom of the Yellow River to the silence of forgotten kings, but by understanding one's place within it. From the tombs of Egypt to the symmetry of Harappa, humanity was not just surviving. It was remembering, it was building, it was beginning to write its own myth. Part 5. The Greeks and the Romans, the foundations of the West before empires clashed. Before democracy had a name, there were whispers of logic, reason, and power. From the rocky coasts of Greece to the marble pillars of Rome, two civilizations laid the foundation for what we now call the modern West. Ancient Greece, the awakening of the mind. Greece did not rise with empire. It rose with thought. Scattered city-states like Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and Thebes, each unique, often at odds, yet bound by a shared language, culture, and destiny. Athens chose democracy not for all, but for some. Still, it was a beginning. Men gathered in assemblies, debated openly, questioned tradition. Philosophy wasn't a subject, it was a way of life. Socrates asked questions no one wanted to answer. Plato dreamed of ideal forms. Aristotle dissected reality itself. Mathematics, medicine, poetry, architecture, astronomy, everything was up for examination. Yet Greek greatness wasn't only mental, it was martial. The Spartans, warriors of discipline, the Athenians, defenders of freedom. Together, they repelled the Persian Empire at Thermopylae and Salamis, not with numbers, but with will. And in a short burst of time, it created what the world would chase for millennia. A civilization where man was not just a subject of fate, but a seeker of truth. Alexander the Great, the dream that burned bright, then came a boy from Macedonia, Alexander. Tutored by Aristotle, fueled by ambition. By age 20, he became king. By 30, he had conquered Egypt, Persia, and parts of India. His armies didn't just carry swords, they carried ideas. He spread Greek language, art, architecture, and philosophy across continents. But the flame that burns brightest, burns shortest. Alexander died young, his empire fractured. But his vision never faded. He proved an idea could ride on horseback, cross deserts, and change entire worlds. Ancient Rome, the empire of order and power, where Greece questioned, Rome conquered. Rome began as a small city. It ended up ruling the known world. It built not just cities, but systems. Law, roads, aqueducts, military discipline, governance. The Roman Republic balanced power, consuls, senates, assemblies. But republics are fragile when ambition grows. Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon. He defied the Senate. He was loved by the people and murdered by his peers. From his ashes rose an empire. Augustus, the first emperor, ushered in Pax Romana, 200 years of relative peace. Rome ruled with strength, but also seduction. They offered citizenship, stability, trade, and roads that all led back to one place, Rome. But Rome didn't just dominate, it absorbed. It adopted Greek gods, Egyptian cults, Eastern riches. It was a melting pot before the term existed. And yet the cracks formed. Decadence, corruption, overreach, invasions, even empires that seem eternal are not. Part 6. The Islamic Golden Age from the 8th to the 14th century, a forgotten light in the dark. In the silence of the desert winds, a spark ignited. Baghdad, the year is 762, a new city. Born from the dreams of the Abbasid caliphs, soon to become the heart of the world's knowledge. This was not Europe. This was not Rome. This was the Islamic world, and it was about to illuminate the earth. Under the rule of Caliph al-Mansur, Baghdad became the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. But it was his descendant, Caliph Harun al-Rashid, who planted the seeds of a revolution not of swords, but of science. The House of Wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah. More than just a library, it was a beacon of learning. Here, scholars of every religion, every language, came together. Muslims, Christians, Jews, Persians, Arabs, Greeks, all gathered under one roof. They didn't ask, "Who are you?" They asked, "What do you know?" The works of Aristotle, Plato, Galen, Ptolemy, translated into Arabic, preserved when Europe had forgotten them. In this golden silence, they rediscovered algebra. Al-Khwarizmi, the man behind algorithms. From his name comes the word itself. They charted the stars, mapped the skies with stunning precision, developed surgical tools still used today, invented the camera obscura, the first scientific study of optics. While Europe slept in superstition, the Muslim world calculated the Earth's circumference, built hospitals, founded universities, and challenged the cosmos with logic. Cordoba, Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad, cities of light. 1001 Nights were not fairy tales, they were echoes of a civilization at its peak. But as every sun sets by the 13th century, the Mongols arrived. The Tigris ran black with ink and red with blood. Baghdad was burned. The silence returned. Not the silence of wisdom, but of destruction. Yet the knowledge survived. Through trade, through conquest, through memory, it moved west. Europe would awaken with it, but the world would forget where it began. And that, perhaps, is the true tragedy of history. To understand the future, we must remember who first lit the flame. Part 7. The Middle Ages, when empires fell silent, but humanity whispered on. The Roman Empire was gone. What was once a united realm of roads, laws, and cities shattered into scattered kingdoms. It was the 5th century, and Europe fell into what many call the Dark Ages. But was it truly darkness? Let's begin at the beginning. The collapse of Rome didn't erase civilization. It fragmented it. And in those fragments, something new began. The silent struggle in cold stone monasteries. Monks lit candles. They copied ancient texts by hand, word by word, preserving Greek philosophy, Latin poetry, and the Bible. They kept the memory of a world that had passed. Meanwhile, outside the cloisters, Europe became a land of lords and serfs, castles and kings. Feudalism took hold. Power flowed not from reason, but from land and sword. Yet even in this hierarchy, life endured. People farmed, sang, told stories by firelight. Villages grew. Traditions formed. Languages evolved. But the church and the crown, the Christian church, rose as the most powerful institution in Europe. It crowned kings. It guided empires. It decided what was sacred and what was heresy. And while it preached peace, it also launched war. The Crusades, a series of brutal religious wars, sent thousands eastward to reclaim the Holy Land. But with swords came stories. Books, a flood of knowledge returning from Islamic lands. It was through these holy wars that Europe accidentally rediscovered Aristotle. Paradox. In war, they found wisdom. A world beyond Europe, but while Europe rebuilt, other worlds flourished. In Africa, the empire of Mali rose, with kings like Mansa Musa, so rich his pilgrimage to Mecca altered economies. In Asia, the Tang and Song dynasties in China led golden ages of poetry, printing, and gunpowder. The Mongols, fierce as fire, conquered from the Pacific to the Danube, yet under their rule, the Silk Road thrived. Ideas, goods, and disease traveled that road. And then, in 1347, something devastating arrived in Europe. The Black Death, a silent enemy. A plague, bubonic, merciless. In just a few years, 1/3 of Europe's population vanished. Villages emptied. Cities turned to graves. The church's power wavered. People began to ask, if God is good, why this? Questions. Dangerous ones, and they would not go unanswered for long. A seed beneath the snow. Despite the death and darkness, a seed was growing. New thoughts, new languages, new ways to see the world, because history doesn't stop. It moves in silence, in minds, in manuscripts. In the quiet rebellion of a child who asks, why? And soon, Europe would awaken. Part 8. The Renaissance and Enlightenment. When man remembered and dared to question everything, Europe was wounded. The Black Death had shaken faith. Feudalism had grown fragile. And in that silence, amid ruins and questions, something extraordinary happened. A whisper from the past returned. A whisper of reason, art, and human potential. They called it Renaissance, a rebirth, the reawakening. It began in Italy, Florence, to be exact. Not with war, but with paintbrushes. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael didn't just decorate churches. They reimagined man as divine and flawed, intelligent and powerful. Perspective changed literally. Paintings grew deep, realistic, human. Sculptures breathed. The human body was no longer shameful. It was magnificent. This wasn't just art. It was a philosophy. Man was no longer small under the heavens. He was capable, worthy of wonder. The power of print, and then around 1440 Johannes Gutenberg changed everything. The printing press. Before this, books were rare, copied by hand. Now, they flowed like rivers. Ideas could travel. Knowledge escaped the walls of monasteries. Anyone who could read could think. And those who could think began to question. The protest that shook the church in 1517, a monk named Martin Luther nailed a piece of paper to a church door in Germany. 95 arguments against the corruption of the church. It wasn't just a protest, it was a revolution. The Protestant Reformation split Europe spiritually and politically. Wars would follow, blood would spill, but the age of blind obedience was ending. The scientific revolution, as men questioned religion, they also questioned nature. Was Earth really the center of the universe? Copernicus said no. Galileo built a telescope and proved it. Saw moons orbiting Jupiter, not Earth. The church silenced him, but the truth had already escaped. Then came Kepler, Newton, Descartes, and with them, the rise of science. Gravity was no longer magic. The body was no longer mystery. Lightning, tides, blood, stars, all had laws. The universe wasn't chaos, it was ordered, and man, he could understand it. The Enlightenment from science grew philosophy. What is truth? What is power? What is freedom? Thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, Locke, and Montesquieu challenged kings and popes. They said power should not be divine. It should be earned. Governments should serve the people, not rule them. They believed in reason, rights, and reform. Their words, their books were dangerous, because ideas can spark revolutions. The birth of modernity, these thoughts didn't stay on parchment. In America, in 1776, a colony declared it would govern itself. In France, 1789, the people overthrew a king and demanded liberty, equality, fraternity. The world had changed. It's no longer ruled just by kings and churches, but by principles, science, law. A new world was rising. But was it better or simply different? Because with freedom came factories, with reason came rifles, with knowledge came the hunger to control. And as the sun rose on a new century, so did the ambitions of man. Part 9. Empires, Industry. And the march of modern war, how progress built the future and nearly destroyed it. The Enlightenment had awakened minds. The Renaissance had inspired hearts. But now, it was the hands of man that began to reshape the world, not with swords, but with steam. The industrial spark, it began quietly in the 18th century in Britain. Coal, iron, steam. Three forces that turned villages into cities, farmers into factory workers, and muscle into machines. Industrial Revolution. For the first time in human history, work was no longer bound by sunlight or limited by muscle. Machines never slept, factories never rested, and the world would never be the same. The rise of the machine's smoke rose from chimneys like flags of a new empire, the empire of industry. Cities swelled. Children worked 14-hour days. Women toiled in textile mills. Men lost limbs to gears they didn't understand. But the profits, they soared. Steamships crossed oceans, trains linked nations. Telegraphs sent thoughts through wires. It was progress, but not for all. The scramble for the world industry needed more and more resources, more markets, more power. So Europe looked outward, to Africa, Asia, the Americas, and carved up continents with ink and blood. They called it colonization, but it was conquest. The British Empire stretched from Canada to India to Australia. The French, Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese all claimed their share. In Berlin, 1884, world powers sat in suits, drawing borders across Africa, ignoring tribes, cultures, people. They brought railways and schools, but also slavery, famine, and guns. The sun never set on the empires, but it often set on the people beneath their boots. The myth of superiority with conquest came a dangerous idea that some nations, some races, were destined to rule. It was dressed in science, called social Darwinism. Survival of the fittest, twisted into a tool of oppression. White men justified chains and bullets with civilization. Indigenous voices were silenced with scripture and rifles. Progress had a price, and it was paid in lives. The world catches fire by 1900. The world was a powder keg. Empires had grown arrogant. Alliances had grown tight. Armies had grown massive. And technology had made killing mechanical. Then a single shot in Sarajevo, 1914, a prince assassinated, and the world unraveled. World War I trenches, gas, barbed wire, machine guns, a war so vast, so senseless, so brutal, they called it the war to end all wars. But it didn't. Industry meets war for the first time. War was not fought by warriors, but by nations. Entire populations were mobilized. Women built bullets. Children gathered scrap metal. Factories made tanks instead of tools. Science, once a path to truth, now built poison gas. And when the guns fell silent in 1918, millions were dead. Empires had fallen: Austria, Hungary, Ottoman, Russian. But peace was brittle because the world had changed. It could never go back. The illusion of peace, the 1920s, came like a breath of relief, but beneath it was pain. Germany, humiliated. Russia, reborn as the Soviet Union. America, roaring with jazz and credit. And then 1929, the Great Depression. Markets crashed. Banks failed. Breadlines grew. Democracy looked weak. And in the silence, the old monsters stirred again. The rise of extremes in Italy, Mussolini. In Germany, Hitler. In Japan, military rule. They promised jobs, glory, revenge, and people desperate, broken, listened. They didn't just want leaders. They wanted saviors. They would follow them into fire. Part 10. The Industrial Revolution, the machines that changed the world. As the 18th century faded into the 19th, something extraordinary began to stir across Europe, especially in Britain. Coal-fired engines, spinning machines, steam-powered trains. The Industrial Revolution wasn't just a shift in how people worked. It was a revolution in how they lived, moved, and thought. Factories began to rise where fields once stood. The rhythm of life, once ruled by seasons, was now dictated by the clock. Men, women, and even children labored long hours, often in dangerous conditions, yet the world was changing faster than ever before. Cities swelled. People left their farms and villages for crowded urban centers. With smoke pouring from chimneys and railways carving across the landscape, this was the dawn of modernity. Innovation exploded. The telegraph connected continents. The light bulb banished the night. Machines once unimaginable transformed industries: textiles, steel, transportation. But with rapid progress came inequality. Industrialists grew rich. Workers struggled. Slums grew. Diseases spread. The working class began to organize. Unions formed. Reformers demanded safer conditions and fair pay. And amid the soot and steel, a deeper question emerged. Are we building machines to serve humanity or to enslave it? Still, there was no turning back. This era would redefine global power. Britain's empire, now powered by machines, stretched across the globe, and other nations followed. Germany, France, the United States, all caught in the race to industrialize. The 19th century ended with electricity, railroads, and steel empires. The 20th would begin with something else entirely, a century of world wars, ideology, and transformation. This was just the beginning. The machine had been set in motion. Part 11. World Wars and Empires. When the world tore itself apart, the machine had been set in motion. But no one realized it was speeding toward the most violent century in human history. The 20th century began with hope. Hope powered by steam, steel, science, and empire. But beneath the surface, tensions were rising. Empires had grown too big. Nations had grown too proud, and weapons had grown too deadly. The world before the wars in 1900, Europe ruled the world. Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, each controlled vast empires from Africa to Asia. But power came with paranoia. Alliances formed like whispered promises in the dark. Britain and France, Germany and Austria. Russia watched nervously. The Ottoman Empire, once mighty, was crumbling. So was China. So were the old ways of war. Industrialization hadn't just changed factories, it had changed warfare. World War I. The war to end all wars, but it didn't. In June 1914, a gunshot in Sarajevo changed everything. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, and like dominoes, the world fell into chaos. Germany invaded Belgium, Britain declared war, France mobilized, Russia joined. America watched for now. It wasn't quick, it wasn't glorious. It was mud, blood, and barbed wire. Trenches scarred Europe. Soldiers lived like ghosts. Gas choked the air. Machine guns turned courage into casualty. Over 16 million people died. When it was over, empires collapsed. Austria-Hungary dissolved. The Ottoman Empire vanished. The Russian Tsar was overthrown. The Treaty of Versailles punished Germany too harshly. Quietly, resentment began to fester. Between the wars, revolutions, and shadows in Russia, Lenin rose. The Bolsheviks took power. The world saw its first communist state. Meanwhile, the 1920s roared in the West. Jazz, cars, radio, cinema, but underneath, instability. Then came 1929, the Great Depression. Banks collapsed. Unemployment soared. People searched for answers, and some found them in dangerous ideologies. World War II, if the first war was about empires, the second was about survival. In Germany, a failed artist named Adolf Hitler rose to power. He promised glory. He blamed others, Jews, communists, foreigners, and he rebuilt Germany's military. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war. This time, the world could not look away. Japan expanded in Asia. Italy joined Germany. And the Nazi war machine tore through Europe. France fell. Britain stood alone. The skies rained fire in the Blitz, but then Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. The United States joined. The war became global. The war's darkest hours, the Holocaust. 6 million Jews exterminated. Alongside Roma, disabled people, political dissidents, death camps, gas chambers. A darkness humanity had never witnessed. Cities were flattened. Millions of soldiers died. Millions more civilians perished. And in August 1945, the atomic bomb, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, 2 flashes, 2 cities gone, and the world changed forever. The aftermath: Germany was defeated, Japan surrendered. But the victory came with a price. Over 70 million lives lost. The United Nations was born, a fragile hope for peace. Europe lay in ruins. Empires broke apart. The age of empires was over. A new struggle would begin. The Cold War begins. 2 superpowers now stood tall: the United States and the Soviet Union. Capitalism versus communism. NATO versus Warsaw Pact. A war not of bullets, but of spies, satellites, and ideology. Transition: the 20th century had burned with fire and fury. But it wasn't the end, only a turning point. As colonies gained independence, as nations rebuilt, and as technology soared, a new world was taking shape. Part 12. The post-colonial world. The sun had long set on the empires that once ruled the world. But in the ashes of conquest, new nations were quietly rising. India -1947, the clock struck midnight, and the chains of the British Raj were finally broken. India, after centuries of foreign rule, declared its independence. But this freedom came at a terrible cost. Partition. Millions were displaced, thousands killed. The price of freedom was paid in blood. Africa, 1950s, 70s. Across the African continent, the winds of change were gathering. One by one, colonial flags were lowered, and the people reclaimed the lands that were once theirs. Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, each independence. A triumph, yet not without struggle. New leaders emerged, but so did new challenges. Poverty, tribal conflicts, and the remnants of imperial divide. Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, post-colonialism wasn't always peaceful. In Vietnam, decades of war shaped the land and its people. In Cambodia, a genocide under the Khmer Rouge stunned the world. Indonesia, once under Dutch control, became a symbol of resistance and resilience.
Latin America.
Latin America, long under economic and political influence of colonial powers, sought its own voice. Its movements for land reform, education, and sovereignty clashed with dictatorships and foreign interference. The Cold War would only deepen these divisions. The Middle East: new nations, old tensions. The Middle East saw the fall of Ottoman control replaced by European mandates. As borders were redrawn without regard to tribes or history, conflicts ignited, especially around Israel and Palestine, a region forever entangled in the legacy of imperial lines. The Caribbean and Pacific Islands, small nations with big dreams. Jamaica, Trinidad, Fiji, once islands in the shadows, now free. Struggling to define what it meant to be truly sovereign in a globalized world, the map of the modern world is a product of this post-colonial shift. Lines drawn by history, borders shaped by battles. And yet beneath it all, the human story remains one of resilience. From Rebel Rise. Part 13. The Cold War and Globalization. The world had just survived 2 world wars, but peace was a fragile illusion. In the silence after the storm, a new war began, not with guns, but with ideologies. The Cold War begins in 1945 Yalta Conference. The Allies had won, but they were no longer allies. On one side, the United States, waving the banner of capitalism and democracy. On the other, the Soviet Union, defending communism with iron resolve. They had fought together, but the peace would tear them apart. Berlin, a city divided Germany, was carved like a broken loaf. Berlin, its heart, became a cold battleground. In the West, neon lights and Coca-Cola. In the East, silence, surveillance, and Stalin. A wall would rise, brick by brick, turning neighbors into enemies. The arms race and space race, 1950s, 1960s missiles multiplied. So did paranoia. Oh, the Cuban Missile Crisis, one breath away from nuclear war. But while nations threatened to destroy each other, they also reached for the stars. Sputnik, Yuri Gagarin. Then Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. It wasn't just a race through the sky. It was a race to prove whose system would rule the future. Spies, shadows, and silent wars. Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan. The Cold War wasn't always cold. Proxy wars broke out from the rice fields of Vietnam to the mountains of Afghanistan. The US and USSR never directly fought, but their weapons, money, and ideologies did. CIA, KGB, espionage. It was a war of whispers and revolutions. Enter globalization, 1970s, 1990s, as borders blurred and economies opened. A new force emerged quietly beneath the political storm's globalization. Corporations became multinational, technology connected continents, shipping containers transformed trade, and the internet would change everything. Cultures clashed and blended. Jeans in Tokyo, Bollywood in London, McDonald's in Moscow. The world was shrinking, but also becoming more unequal. The fall of the Iron Curtain, 1989, Berlin Wall falls then. In one unforgettable moment, the wall came down. East Berliners crossed over. Tears, music, freedom. The Soviet Union collapsed like a crumbling statue. For the first time in nearly a century, the Cold War was over. But a new world was just beginning. Global Village, 1990s, 2000s, globalization raced forward. Mobile phones, email, social media. The world was suddenly everywhere. Jobs moved overseas. Cultures collided online. News spread in seconds. And yet poverty, war, and inequality endured. The same technology that connected also divided. From the silence of the Iron Curtain to the noise of the information age, humanity kept evolving, but the question still remains. Did we move forward or just faster? Part 14. Digital age to present day by the end of the 20th century. The world had changed more in 100 years than it had in the previous 1,000. But the real transformation was yet to come. The digital age began not with fireworks, but with silent code, a pulse through copper wire, a flicker on a silicon chip. And soon the world was connected. In 1969, a group of researchers sent the first message over ARPANET, the ancestor of the internet. It crashed after just 2 letters, but that law was the start of something massive. The 1980s brought personal computers. Bill Gates and Steve Jobs weren't just inventors, they were architects of a new society. And by the 1990s, the World Wide Web turned homes into hubs of infinite knowledge. Suddenly, anyone anywhere could communicate across continents. Borders became ideas. Time zones collapsed. And information became power. By the early 2000s, the mobile revolution began. Phones got smarter, smaller, faster. Apps, social media, cloud computing. We weren't just using the internet, we were living inside it. A 12-year-old in Bangladesh could learn quantum physics on YouTube. A grandmother in Kenya could sell her art online. Knowledge no longer belonged to the elite. It was everywhere. But there was a cost. Privacy eroded. Misinformation spread like wildfire. The line between truth and noise blurred, and mental health became the silent casualty of the scrolling age. Still, the potential was breathtaking. Artificial intelligence, blockchain, gene editing. We began to ask, if machines can think, what is a human? COVID-19 in 2020 was a harsh reminder that despite all our progress, we were still vulnerable. One virus, and the world stopped. Streets went silent. Borders closed. But we adapted fast. Remote work, telemedicine, digital classrooms, a global reset. And today, we stand on the edge of another leap. Quantum computing, brain-machine interfaces, a new space race, not just to the moon but to Mars. The 21st century is no longer about tools. It's about transformation, of species, of society, of self. Yet with all our advancement, one question remains. Have we grown wiser? Have our souls kept up with our speed? Or are we racing into the future without asking why? Because civilization isn't just technology, it's memory, it's meaning. And as we code our future, we must remember our past. Not just the wars and empires, but the quiet revolutions in thought, heart, and spirit. And this leads us to our final reflection. Part 15. The final reflection. What it all means. This isn't just the end of a story. It's the beginning of a deeper question. We've walked through 10,000 years of human civilization, from fire to fiber optics, from cave paintings to space travel, from myth to machine. But what does it all mean? What is civilization really? Is it our cities, our systems, our science? Or is it something quieter? The way a mother sings to her child in the dark? The way strangers reach out during disaster? The way a dying man whispers forgiveness? Civilization is not just what we build, it's what we believe. It's not only our inventions, but our intentions. The wheel and the worship, the pen and the prison, the internet and the algorithm, these are all tools. But the soul behind them, that's what defines our path. A society can reach the stars and still lose itself. We can know everything but understand nothing, can measure the brain but never touch the mind. We can own the world but forget how to live in it. So here's the deeper truth. Civilization isn't linear. It doesn't just go forward, it rises, it falls, it forgets, then it remembers. It remembers what matters. Kindness, curiosity, silence, purpose. The ancients left us clues. Socrates said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Lao Tzu taught, "Knowing others is intelligence. Knowing yourself is true wisdom." The Buddha walked away from luxury to find peace in suffering. And prophets throughout time reminded us that truth isn't shouted, it's whispered. It doesn't live in power, it lives in presence. So where are we now? We are a species between stories. Between old myths that no longer serve and a new vision that hasn't yet formed, we're more connected than ever, yet lonelier. More advanced, yet more anxious. And maybe, just maybe, that's the test of this generation. To build not just faster systems, but wiser selves. Not just smart cities, but soulful communities. Not just new technologies, but timeless truths. What is the future of civilization? It's not out there, it's in here. In the choices we make when no one's watching, in the conversations we have with ourselves, in how we treat the earth and how we treat each other. Civilization is not a tower, it's a mirror. And right now the world is asking us to look. As we end this series, take a breath. Close your eyes and ask yourself, what kind of ancestor will I be? What will I leave behind, not in stone or code, but in consciousness? You're a part of this story now, you always were. And your silence, your depth, your awakening may just be the next chapter civilization is waiting for. Thank you for walking through the quiet corridors of history with us. This was not just a documentary, it was a meditation. Subscribe to Still Rise. And now, the real journey begins.